So hello everyone, I'm Mary Urueña, founder of LifeRidge. We are going to be holding a number of interviews with fabulous doctors who go off the beaten path in the United States and abroad. So stay tuned for that. Today we are interviewing Dr. Jeffrey Gladden. He wrote this amazing book called 100 is the New 30, which is a very daring title, but he really lives by it and achieves results that are compatible with this title. Dr. Gladden was an interventional cardiologist for 25 years and then opened his practice up to, let's say, more thoughtful ways of doing medicine, and he will explain why that was also. Today, he is the CEO and the founder of Gladden Longevity. You can go to gladdenlongevity.com or gladdenpodcast.com to find more about what he does. And he practices what I would say is one of the most well-researched and valuable medicine clinics in the world. But today we are going to be interviewing him about this book, which is really a must read, I believe. You can find it on Amazon. I bought it there. And it's 500 pages full of wisdom and thoughtfulness and really concepts that really debunk what we all thought about things like exercise and many other longevity impacting technologies. So Dr. Gladden, thank you for being here.
Hi, Mary-Lise. Good to see you.
And thank you very much for writing this wonderful book, which has taken me a lot of hours to write. It's 500 pages full of incredible content, really thoughtful observations on mental health, psychological health, emotional well-being, and then a lot of science.
That's right.
Science that measures the state of a patient and gives you clues as to where to go forward, and then you have lots of answers also.
That's right.
So it's really wonderful to have you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Yeah, great.
So I would like to start asking you, what made you write this book, and how do you hope it will change the perspective on aging and longevity for the readers?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote the book really because I felt like there's so many misconceptions about longevity. I think it's really poorly characterized and not well understood. Our frame of reference is that we're going to get older and we're going to age, right? And that's been normalized by every construct of society has normalized that. Our families normalize that. Our governments normalize that. Our employers normalize that. Well, you're getting older, it's time to retire. You're getting older, you shouldn't be doing that. You need to start doing this. It's time to start doing these things differently, right? And so there's all this messaging that we have around aging that suggests that longevity is this decline, right? And so if I'm going to live a long time, well, I'm going to be in decline for a longer period of time. And the other major misconception about aging is that it's not a linear decline. It's actually an exponential decline. And I find that people can't really relate to that because even though we see it all around us, right? You know that your parents, in their last years really declined much quicker than they did earlier on, or your grandparents or whomever. We have a hard time relating to that because if I ask, what are you going to be like 10 years from now, right? What are you going to be like 15 years from now? It's almost impossible to imagine you're going to be any different than you are right now. So we're really handicapped. We're in a game that's an exponential game, and yet we have a linear concept, and we're already tied into a mindset that says we're just going to decline over time. So I think really to reframe the entire construct is really what I was going for in the book, because I think longevity is not about lasting a long time on a downward slope. It's actually about staying young for a long time, right? And that's why I'm really focused on staying young. And I think that when you think about that, it has a profound impact on everything else that comes forward. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In the book, I found it really interesting that you talk a lot about personal experiences. Mm-hmm. Your grandparents, your grandfather was a really important figure in your life.
That's right.
You took trips with him. You were committing some transgressions with him that your
That's
mother
right.
and your grandmother would not want to
That's
hear
right.
about. And then he passed away at age 97.
Mm-hmm.
And then your grandmother, who was a really comes across as a really sweet
Yeah.
lady, passed away also at 96. Six
That's
weeks
right.
later.
6 weeks later, yeah. She lost the will to live, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was such a lesson to me in how powerful the mind is in terms of our life force, our life energy, right? And in her case, when he passed, they'd been married since she was quite young. I think he might have been close to 30 when they got married. She was in her 20s. They married kind of late for their era. But nonetheless, when he passed, she just checked out. It was like, I'm done. And she really lost the will to live. And she literally passed in 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized from that, you see other people that it's the exact opposite. They have such a strong will to live that even in the face of cancer or challenges or losses around them, that they not only survive, but they thrive. And so I started to realize just how incredibly significant and powerful how we think and what our motivation is to this whole idea of longevity and living young.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That brings me to the next thought or question, which is a growth mindset.
Yeah.
My grandfather died when he was 105.
Okay.
And I attribute that mostly, he had really good genes,
Yeah.
but also I attribute that to the fact that he really had a growth mindset.
Yeah.
He was always learning. He was always doing something new.
Yep.
He started painting in his 90s.
Yep.
He wrote poetry.
Beautiful.
Did all kinds of things.
I love it.
So, and Carol Dweck, as you know, has been the
Yeah.
main psychologist at Stanford
That's
behind the growth mindset.
Yeah. And I love Carol Dweck, and I love her book, Mindset. I reference that in the book. I think for me, people say a growth mindset. Okay, well, what is a growth mindset? For me, it's really being more intrigued and married to the questions than it is the current answers.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people go through life to ultimately define their answers. Like, okay, this is how we think about food. This is how we think about relationships. This is how we think about politics. This is how we think about religion. This is how we think about exercise. And they're focused on actually canonizing these answers that they've come across, and this becomes their life now. I call it getting married to your answers. And yet, because you're on this game of exponential decline, which a linear strategy will never solve. You have to have an exponential strategy. The first step to having an exponential strategy is to be married to the questions, not the current answers, right? And so the questions we have are, how good can I be, right? How fit, how strong, how mentally sharp, how many years and decades can we carry it forward? How relationally replete, how spiritually ascended can we become, right? How good can we be? Then how do we make 100 a new 30? How do we live young for a lifetime? And how do we actually crack the code on living beyond 120? So in my world, we have literally thousands of answers I never had as an interventional cardiologist. And yet we wake up every day with those 4 questions. How do we do it? How do we get there? How do we make it better? How do we learn? How do we grow? And to me, that's a growth mindset. Mm-hmm. So for the audience listening, the thing I would ask you to do is think about what questions are driving you, and think much more about those questions and refining those than the answers that you currently have. Because answers have a shelf life. They only last for a certain period of time, and then they're no longer applicable, right? But the questions go on. The questions are more eternal. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So you also describe in the first part of your book, which is about life forces, life energies, mm-hmm. you talk about trauma, you talk about feeling joy, you talk about feeling worthy, feeling mm-hmm. safe. Mm-hmm. All of these are emotional aspects that
That's right.
make us, grow, make us age more or
That's
less.
Right. That's right.
More quickly or less quickly, because they are closely tied to stress, for instance.
Yep. So, yeah. You want me to comment on those?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
So, I think everybody on the planet, I've never met a person who hasn't. Everybody on the planet has had trauma in their lives. We've all had traumas, right? In childhood, we had traumas. As adolescents, we had traumas. As adults, we've had traumas. And the interesting thing about the human psyche is that we tend to live in reaction to those traumas, right? So if something happened to you as a kid, then you carry that forward and you're living in reaction to that. And in my case, I was able to figure out the things that I was living in reaction to. And I realized that it was putting me on tilt. You know, like a poker player that loses 3 hands in a row and now they're on tilt and everybody at the table knows it and they're actually on tilt, but they may not be aware of it, but everybody else knows that now they're vulnerable to losing more hands. And so when we're living in reaction, it really compromises our ability to be our full self, right? Because we're not unencumbered, right? And I think the real goal of trauma is, number one, it all happens to everybody, so understand it, and then go back and heal it. And that's a process. There's psycho-spiritual elements to go into healing it. And then you get to a point where you can transcend it, right? It may always have a whiff in the background where it's something that you could go back and reference, but it no longer is putting you on tilt. You become your unencumbered self, and you're no longer living in reaction to the trauma that happened to you, the abandonment that happened, whatever it might be, the physical trauma, the emotional trauma, the psychological abuse, the physical abuse, whatever may have happened. There's an ability to put that in the backdrop and say, no, I'm going to claim to be my unencumbered self. And you transcend those traumas, and now it's like, oh, it's a new world. Now I can really breathe myself. I can really bring my gifts forward, right? Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about that is it has such an impact on health and longevity, because now you're not living like this. You're living like this. It's like, wow, what a beautiful day. What a beautiful life. You're grateful for everything. And all of a sudden, everything shifts. Your biology shifts, quite honestly. Really fascinating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I have a quote from your book that I really like. It says, my definition of heaven has now become knowing and being known, loving and feeling loved, and feeling absolute safety.
That's right.
So how do you get there?
That's right. So this is a really important thing. So I had an epiphany one night. I woke up at 2 a.m. and I couldn't sleep. I went upstairs. I was living in a 2-story home at the time, and I went into my office and I pulled out Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, which I always have enjoyed that book. And I read I don't know, 2 or 3 sentences. I wasn't like a book that I would read. I would just read enough to kind of put me into a meditative state. So I did that, and I'll never forget, my head kind of rocked back, and I went into this really deep meditative state, and all of a sudden, it was like everything became clear. There was this river of love flowing through everything. And on the other side of this river was a being, an entity. And this entity knew me perfectly, right? Knew me perfectly. And I knew this entity perfectly. And this entity loved me completely. And I loved this entity. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is a really spiritual, godlike experience. And it became clear to me that heaven has nothing to do with pearly gates and gold and silver. Nobody cares about that. That's trinkets, right? What we care about is connection, feeling loved, feeling safe. And I felt so safe, so loved, and so known that at that moment I said, okay, this is now my definition of heaven. Knowing and being known, loving and being loved. And that translates into relationships, right? If you're in a relationship with someone, what's the goal? To get along, to build a life, to whatever. I think the real goal is to grow. To grow. And the way you do that is by knowing deeply the other person and continuing to know that person. So knowing and being known and loving and being loved. And then safety is a huge one, right? Because virtually all stress, all anxiety, all anger, fear, all of it comes down to not feeling safe. And so how do you actually give yourself safety, right? How do you give yourself self-love first, right? So you have to be able to love yourself. And I have this image of myself scooping up my little 2-year-old self saying, oh my gosh, what a precious life, right? What a precious little person. And each of you can do that. And then this idea of safety, when you realize there's nothing external to you that can ever make you feel safe, you stop worrying about, well, how much money do I have, and where do I live, and where's my family, and all these other things. Those are all beautiful things, but ultimately they don't give you safety. So then how do you actually give yourself safety? And that becomes the challenge, right? And just like I can scoop myself up and love myself, I can scoop myself up and make myself feel safe. But then also the spiritual connection that I feel, this eternal element of it all, it's like, no, I'm fundamentally safe, right? That experience I had in the meditation is like, no, I am safe, right? And so when I reference that, that's my ultimate source of safety. And again, stress goes down. It's like, okay, things are not going exactly the way I thought, but things are working out. Mm-hmm. And so you can relax. It's an amazing way to live.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And how about relational health?
Yeah.
You mentioned the power of having courageous conversations.
That's right.
With your partner.
Yes, I think, we actually, Mukti and I did a podcast on this, my partner, and, I've been married twice before. And the question was really not what was wrong with the people, but why was I choosing the people I chose, mm-hmm. right? Why was I choosing these people? And it was because I was living in reaction to traumas that occurred in my life when I was young, right? Relative to my mom and my family and some other things, right? And so I was choosing people that weren't going to try to smother me, but they didn't have the ability for real deep emotional connection, right? And so I got caught in that conundrum. So until I unraveled that knot, until I understood that, solved that, and then transcended that, then I was able to actually attract and be available to somebody that actually had the things that I was after. And once you find that person, it's this first step, but you really have to have what I call courageous conversations to really understand each other. And it's a fascinating concept because we think about relationships, we want them to become comfortable. But what we really need is we need those relationships to be growth relationships. Otherwise, they go flat over time. So in order to do that, you have to have these courageous conversations where you really feel like you're risking everything to bring this up. Like, I don't know if this is going to end the relationship or not, but I need to bring this up. This is really how I'm feeling. And have the other person hold that and listen to that in a gentle way, right? And then me be able to step outside of myself and say, oh, I'm looking at that. How does that feel to you? And then the other person come back and say, well, this is what I'm feeling. It's like, well, let me hold that. And you end up really kind of bearing your soul to each other, but in a gentle way, not in a butting heads way, really in a growth mindset way. And so when you have these very courageous conversations, intimacy just goes through the roof. I mean, it just fuels it like nothing you've ever done before.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So in terms of trauma and
mm-hmm.
dealing with trauma,
yeah.
you mentioned how you dealt with traumas
yeah.
and were able to transcend them and were able to enjoy life in an unencumbered
That's
manner.
right. Yeah.
So what is your advice to our viewers about how to deal with trauma?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to understand that we live in reaction to traumas that we can identify. And we also are living in reaction to things that we don't even recognize are traumas. This is the interesting part. In other words, there's things that you could reference and say, yeah, well, this happened to me and that happened to me, and I realize that I'm living in reaction to that. But there are certain things also that we've so normalized that we don't even realize that we're living in reaction to it anymore. And so understanding that it's really important to identify all the things that you think you're living in trauma to, and then realize that there may be things that you need somebody else to tell you, based on the way you go through life. It feels to me like you're living in reaction to something like this. Could that possibly be true? And then all of a sudden things start to come up. So now you'll build a repertoire of all the things that are there, and then you go into each one by one and say, okay, where'd that come from? How did that happen? How do I understand that? How did it make me feel? And then how do I actually heal that, right? And how do I forgive that person? How do I then transcend it? How do I get to a point where I become grateful for everything that ever happened? Because it all shaped me and moved me in a way that enabled me to do the things I'm doing now and has opened up a bigger future. So when in transcendence, you really become grateful for everything that's ever happened. That's really what happens. But it is a process, and it's a commitment. Some of it's done with personal reflection. I've done a lot of it that way, but I've also had great, I've worked with some therapists, and I've worked with some great people that were friends that also were very psychologically and spiritually attuned, that helped me work through some things. So I think that's kind of the approach. Yeah.
Very interesting. So, longevity.
Yeah.
There is an article by Carlos Lopez Otti that you mentioned in your book that basically highlights the hallmarks of aging.
Yeah.
I think some of them, some others were added based on the work of David Sinclair.
Yep.
Could you
and others.
Could you discuss what are these hallmarks of aging?
So the way to think about hallmarks of aging, this paper you're referencing was in 2013 that was published, and there were 9 hallmarks that were delineated. I'm not going to delineate them right here, but they're all in the book. And what they boil down to is they are sort of simultaneously expressions of the aging process at a biological level, and they also tend to fuel the aging process at the same time. So think of them as both what we call a phenotypic expression of aging and also a driver of aging, right? So if you're really going to impact longevity, you have to have a strategy that goes directly at these hallmarks of aging. So everybody talks about longevity. Well, here's the right diet, and here's what you need to eat, and you need to focus on sleep, and you need to lower your stress, and you need to exercise, you need to have all these things. That's great, but I can tell you, everybody that ever did that, they still got old, right? They still aged and they still died. So ultimately, it's critical. You have to have it, but it's not enough. You have to actually go after these biological hallmarks of aging and go right at them, like re-lengthening your telomeres, pruning senescent cells, balancing mTOR and AMPK, right? You've got to go in and actually understand what's driving this and then attack at that point. And it goes well beyond, well, we need to have more protein in our diet, that kind of thing, right? I mean, what are we even talking about, right? It's like, I don't know, it's like a comma at the end of a long sentence, something like that. So I think that in longevity, number one, you want to live young for a lifetime. If you do, you have to be able to focus on these hallmarks of aging and really attack those. And that's what we do in our clinic. We really break that down better than anybody I know about, to go after those, to really enable people to live young for a lifetime.
And that was actually my next question. Based on these hallmarks of aging, where do you start your work at Gladden Longevity?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the first thing that we do with folks when they come in is we want to get an assessment of several things. One, what are your genetics, right? What are you genetically predisposed to, right? Maybe you've got a strong risk for cancer of some sort, or maybe a strong risk for heart disease or metabolic disease or dementia or whatever it might be. We need to know that up front, because we live in a day and age when our genes are not our destiny. If we know somebody's genetic makeup, we can actually orchestrate their environment to change the expression of those genes. So somebody that has ApoE4, let's say, ApoC1 and TOM40, that triad of genes really pushes people towards a high risk of Alzheimer's. But if we know that up front, we can totally shift them back to a normal risk for Alzheimer's, right? Just by knowing their genetics. So you have to start with knowing your genetics. If you don't know what cards you're holding, how are you going to play the game, right? So then the other thing you want to know is, well, where am I in the aging process? And people talk about biological age. Like I had my biological age tested, right? Like I did a lab test and they did an algorithm and it said I was 5 years younger than my chronological age, and so I'm good. Nothing could be further from the truth. We are a mosaic of many, many biological ages, and we're only as young as our oldest age. So you need to know your brain age, your heart age, your blood vessel age, your liver age, your kidney age, right? Your lung age, your telomeric age, your senescent cell burden. If you don't know all these different ages about your DNA methylation age, your rate of aging, if you don't know all these different ages, you're completely shooting in the dark, and you're patting yourself on the back when you may get hit by a bus tomorrow. One of the worst things in cardiology was that somebody would come in and do a stress test, and get a clean bill of health and then go out and have a heart attack and die 2 weeks later, right? What a tragedy. You see, it's the same thing. It's like thinking there's one metric that can tell you where you're at. It's not true. You really have to unravel this knot. Biology is complex, and you have to look at it through that kind of a lens. So that's number two. We want to know where somebody is. Once we know what cards they're holding, where they are, now we come forward with strategies specific to them. This is how we're going to optimize genetic expression. This is how we're going to reverse these processes. This is what we need to do to fix this. And then all of a sudden, people really start to move back in time. So quite beautiful.
Indeed. In your book, you discuss mTOR and AMPK at length in terms of two levers that you need to balance in order to not guarantee but improve your longevity.
That's right.
Could you please explain for in layman's terms what these two drivers are and how do they help?
So one of the hallmarks of aging is called nutrient sensing, dysregulation of nutrient sensing. So what does that actually mean? Well, it turns out that there are two molecules, mTOR and AMPK. Now think of it as a teeter-totter. That's how I think about it. So when you're activating mTOR, right, you're actually activating all of your anabolic growth. You're improving cell division. You're making more bone density. You're building muscle mass. You're repairing. You're healing. You're doing all these things that are good that mTOR does. And so if you're taking growth hormone, testosterone, if you're lifting weights and doing things like that, you're activating mTOR, right? Doing blood flow restriction exercise activates mTOR. Well, that's great, but if you activate mTOR all the time, guess what? You don't live as long, and you have a higher risk of cancer. So how do you modulate that? Well, you activate mTOR part of the time, but then you activate its counterbalancing piece, AMPK. When you activate AMPK, you do this by longer cardio exercise. You do it by intermittent fasting or 5-day fast mimicking diets. You do it with things like that, and you can do it with metformin. This is where metformin comes in, or berberine, or things like resveratrol come in and activate AMPK. And when you do that, you now set off a cascade of genetic activity that actually rejuvenates the body. It increases things like autophagy, where you're recycling out old proteins and out of the cell and refreshing them, and you're starting to increase mitophagy, where you get rid of old mitochondria that aren't working and replace them with new mitochondria. So you're doing all of the rejuvenation work over here. So you're either rejuvenating or you're building, and it's really important to cycle back and forth. And people get hung up on, well, I want to be strong, I want to be big, I want to do this, so I'm going to do this over here. But I want to eat a lot of protein because protein drives mTOR. Well, that's great. You need protein, but you don't need it all the time, right? You need AMPK activated. And if you're not cycling back and forth, which I cycle through it every week, right? I'm cycling. If you're not cycling like that, you're really kind of, I think, sacrificing your health. So.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So about a very common subject, which is exercise, which I know you take to the next level also.
Yes. Yeah, when it comes to exercise, I find that a lot of people have a misconception around exercise. And the misconception is that they think they're working out their muscles. But in actual fact, exercise is all about training the nervous system. So the nervous system controls everything. You know, if somebody's had a stroke, let's say, right, the muscle's useless. It's the nervous system. And when you start lifting weights, for example, you actually are training the nervous system before you're actually training the muscle, right? You're training the strength of the nervous inputs. So when I think about, you know, what it is to be fit, when I'm 100 years old, I want to be fast, agile, strong, quick, balanced, with a great sense of cardiovascular endurance and a great sense of flexibility. And when you're 18 years old, you can get that by lifting some weights and going for a run. But as you go through the decades of life, that no longer works. You have to be training the nervous system in a more comprehensive way. So I do a lot of balance training. I do a lot of training for equilibrium. I do a lot of training for quickness, for agility. And then I do a lot of cardio, and I do some strength training. So a lot of people are very focused on, well, I'm a strength trainer. I'm a bodybuilder. I like this. I grew up lifting weights. I love lifting weights. I hate cardio. You hear that all the time. Interesting thing is there's a gene, and we'll probably talk about this later, called Klotho, Klotho. And it turns out that when you have more Klotho in your system, you live longer. Your blood vessels are better, your brain's better, etc. When you lift weights, guess what happens? Klotho goes down. When you do cardio, Klotho goes up. And I find that many people don't push hard enough when they do exercise. It's almost like they're going through the motions, like they're watching a TV show while they're walking on a treadmill, right? That's activity, but it's not a big enough stress. The body wants to be stressed. If it's going to get strong, it needs to be stressed. And so you need to load your frame to get your bones strong. My bone density is like somebody in their 20s. It's above average for somebody in their 20s, right? My cardiovascular fitness is, great for, exceptional for somebody in their 30s. And so, how do you get that, right? How do you do that? Well, you don't do that by walking on a treadmill. You get that by pushing harder into things. And so embracing the idea of getting breathless and breaking a sweat and doing these things is really, really important. So you want to be cleared for that. You want to make sure it's safe, but you want to go into it thinking, I'm really training my nervous system. And that way you can run down a flight of stairs. If you get tripped, you don't fall down. You don't break your shoulder. You don't break your hip. If you do fall, your body knows how to roll because you've trained your nervous system how to move. This is so critical, I think.
Very interesting perspective.
Yeah, that's kind of how I think about it.
Actually, you also discussed the very important role of a sauna.
Yes.
Using saunas.
Yeah.
You mentioned a study.
Yeah.
Could you talk to us about that?
I mean, saunas, I wasn't even aware of saunas 20 years ago, right? But a study came out from Scandinavia, in Finland, I believe, and they looked at about 3,000 men for over 20 years. They tracked them. And what they found was that people that did a sauna for at least 19 minutes at 180 degrees Fahrenheit, if they did that 4 days a week or more, compared to people that did it 1 day a week, and then the third group was 2 or 3 days a week, they didn't compare it to 0, but that was 1 versus 4. They basically saw about a 55% reduction, 65% reduction actually in Alzheimer's and dementia, 50% reduction in heart attack and stroke, 40% reduction in all-cause mortality. And so why would that be? Why would that be? Well, it's a hormetic stress, right? You release heat shock proteins, which help your other proteins to fold properly, right? And when you have these hormetic stresses, the body loves those. It gets stronger, right? I love mountain biking. I rode my mountain bike 2 days this past weekend. It's a Monday right now. And I love pushing so hard. I find most people do not push hard enough when they exercise. I mean, I was all in on these mountain bike rides. And you feel so invigorated by that. It's really, really great to get these hormetic stresses in. And if you couple it with sauna, all the better.
Are there any other hacks that you use in addition to sauna?
Yeah, like 10,000 different things I do. But, there are things that I found to be particularly good for me. We love molecular hydrogen, right? Molecular hydrogen balances oxidative stress. I think that's a foundational supplement. We like things like spermidine, which basically increases autophagy. But I cycle these in and out based on where I am on that mTOR AMPK cycle, right? So I'm using peptides to help release growth hormone when I'm using testosterone. And then as that cycles back down, I'm doing things to activate AMPK, right? And I'm taking resveratrol. And there's another gene that's become really important, which is called Klotho, spelled Klotho, Klotho, Klotho. And Klotho is a gene that if your levels of Klotho are elevated, you basically, you don't age as much. You live longer, your blood vessels are healthier, you have less chance of dementia, your heart's healthier, exercise capacity is higher. It's like a great thing to have. Mm-hmm. So it turns out that we can now measure the gene for Klotho, right? And so I know my genetics around Klotho. I don't have perfect Klotho genetics. But we have people in our practice that have the worst Klotho genetics, and we have them taking certain supplements something from broccoli called sulforaphane, something from grapes called resveratrol, but a very special resveratrol called Piceid resveratrol. It's found in a supplement called Vinia. And the sulforaphane is found in Abmacol, which is basically combined with myronase to activate the sulforaphane in your system. This gentleman, we just measured this, he has normal clotho levels, even though he should have very depressed clotho levels. So the point is, if you know your genetics, you can pick the hacks that are good for you and do what you need to have done. And that's the key. So, yeah.
How about telomere lengthening?
Yeah.
What's your work around that area?
Yeah, so telomeres are another biological age. Telomeres are the end caps on the chromosomes. Every time a cell divides, we clip off some number of base pairs, right, depending on the cell. And the immune system is dividing the most, so it's shortening the fastest, right? So immunosenescence is another hallmark of aging. Senescence or decreased function, if you will, of the immune system as we age is what we're talking about. So, when you think about that, there are things that will accelerate shortening of telomeres, like smoking, sedentary lifestyle, high insulin levels, high blood sugar, things like that, right? So you want to avoid those things. And then what are the things that will lengthen them? Well, or maintain them. You want to have plenty of fish oil. You want vitamin D. There are supplements that can actually activate the enzyme that re-lengthens them. Telomerase activator 65, TA65, TAM818, isogenis, or a few of those. And then we're working with a product right now, a yogurt, that actually delivers telomerase into the cell to re-lengthen them. And that's under investigation right now. So, there are many, many ways to approach these. And the interesting thing is that telomere length is a good metric of aging in your middle years, let's say between 30 and 75, 80. But after that, there's different mechanisms at play, and telomeres no longer are the best biological clock, right? DNA methylation is probably better than telomeres at that point. So measuring telomeres is important, but also important to know where you are in that chronological age. Yeah.
How about DNA methylation then?
Yeah, it's important. Steve Horvath, UCLA, developed DNA methylation clock, showed that across all mammals, basically these methyl groups, it's a carbon with 3 hydrogens that get attached to DNA. They either get attached or they get unattached. And so as we age, there's a changing pattern of attachment and unattachment. It's not just that as we age, more are attached. It's as we age, the pattern of attachment changes, right? And so they could show that you could predict chronological age by looking at these DNA methylation patterns. Well, there was a paper just published in Nature that I saw this weekend, now looking at DNA methylation that can actually tell you whether or not you're adapting to aging well, or if the DNA methylation patterns are actually accelerating the aging process. So we're getting more refined with the DNA methylation information. And the DNA methylation information can also give us a rate of aging. This was done out of a town in New Zealand where they studied a population of people, and I always mispronounce it. I think it's Dunedin is the name of the town. But with that, you can actually, True Age will measure this. You can get a rate of aging, and that's very helpful because you want to be aging less per chronological year, right? And so that's helpful. And we've seen things that will really impact that, like fasting, 5-day fast mimicking diet, stem cells, young plasma. All these things will impact it, plasmapheresis. And when you start to combine these things intelligently for an individual with their situations, you can do things that are just remarkable. So, yeah.
What kind of results have you seen in your clinic?
Well, we've seen people, go from thinking that it was over to skiing and their kids can't keep up with them anymore, or doing whatever they want. Instead of retiring, they're actually getting ready to start another business, or they're buying new businesses, or it's like they are living a youthful person's life, right? You've heard me say this. I wake up 27 every day, right? I'll have a birthday in a couple of days. Yeah, will have lapped the sun 70 times, but I wake up 27 every day, and it's that mindset of being 27, that reference point of if I don't feel 27, it's like, no, I'm actually 27. So I get back to 27. I want to run, I'm going to run like I'm 27. I went for a run in Dallas the other day, and I was thinking about this birthday. I'm out there running, and I'm thinking, wow, okay, 70, that's 70 years. That's a pretty good number of years. And I was running, and I thought, no, you know what, I'm actually 27. I immediately started running faster. I immediately started running more easily. And I thought, what an amazing thing, right? If I think I'm 70, I'm running slow. If I'm 27, I'm running the way I want. So there you go. It's all in your head.
The power of your brain.
That's right.
Yeah. So you also discuss the concept of senescent associated secondary phenotype.
Yeah.
Quite at length in your book.
I do.
Why is that so important?
Well, because, the story of senescent cells is that basically as telomeres get short, or if cells are damaged, or if the mitochondria don't work properly, for many, many, many different reasons, a cell can become dysfunctional and kind of shut down. And the body will cause a cell to go into senescence where it no longer divides, it no longer really does work, because it's trying to protect the body from, say, the development of cancer or the development of some other problem. And that's a good thing. We need some senescent cells. We don't want to get rid of all the senescent cells. But when you start to build up more and more senescent cells, and they start to take on this new quote phenotype, this new expression of releasing these inflammatory cytokines into the environment, now they're actually recruiting other cells to become senescent, and they're poisoning the environment, and they're making it difficult for the mitochondria to work, and they're increasing the risk of cancer. So yes, you need some senescent cells, but being able to prune those and then remove those inflammatory cytokines makes everything work better. For example, let's say if you're going to get stem cells, right? It's like, well, I'm going to get stem cells. That'll be great. Well, maybe, right? Because if you don't actually get rid of the senescent cytokines out of your system and replace that with young plasma and then give yourself the stem cells, you're not getting near the result that you could. Not near the result that you could. It's more than additive. It becomes an exponential result. And then you're adding in peptides that actually facilitate stem cell function. Oh my gosh, we can heal all kinds of stuff. It's remarkable, really crazy.
Mm-hmm. So how about mitochondria? I hear a lot, I read a lot about the mitochondria, the furnace of energy inside our cells. Many illnesses, like Lyme is one of them. Many illnesses impact the mitochondria. What do you do? Well,
the first thing, really, one of the most important things you can do is to control your metabolic health, right? So this idea of, keeping your blood sugars under a good level, keeping your insulin levels low. And if you don't know what your blood sugar levels are and you don't know what your insulin levels are, then you're really, where are you again? What cards are you holding? Where are you in the game? So we actually measure that with a 2-hour glucose tolerance test with an insulin curve, so we can map out for anybody exactly where they are. So you want to control that. You basically want to control oxidative stress, and that's where hydrogen comes in. And you also want to be exercising, and then you want to increase mitophagy, right? So we use something called urolithin A to actually increase mitophagy. And then there are many things that we do to actually measure mitochondrial function. We're working with University of California, San Diego on a test that they just released. I think we may be the first practice to have it, or whatever, that measures mitochondrial function in more detail than we've had before. And so when we look at that, it gives us insight into where do we push and pull, right? Mitochondria can be sabotaged by heavy metals. They can be sabotaged by lack of nutrients, by lack of factors like certain vitamins. So when you unravel the knot again, and you can see, well, where are your mitochondria struggling, we can actually rebuild them. And ozone's a great way, as you know, to help rebuild mitochondria. So, and exercise. So,
Very interesting. So you take a very scientific approach, as you should, in terms of measuring.
Yes.
First.
It's all about precision, right? All about precision. When I was an interventional cardiologist, I always knew I could get a better result for somebody laying on the table when I was going in to open an artery if I could see and knew what was happening with more precision. If I had more precision, I always got a better result. So the same is true here. We want to have precision. Most clinics, you come to them and they say, well, we've got this therapy. Let's give you this therapy. Let's give you that therapy. We're different. We say, come to us and let us understand you first. Let us really understand you deeply, and then decide what the best way is to move forward. So that's precision.
And going forward, what are your next steps? What do you want to do?
I want to crack the code on aging. I want to actually crack the code on aging, and I want to democratize it for the planet. I want to change the entire glide path of aging for the entire planet. Because when you think about it, what's the worst thing in life? You know, people becoming disabled through the aging process and the diseases associated with the aging process. And I want to change that. I want people to live young, robust, youthful, unencumbered, psychologically, spiritually unencumbered lives to where we can create a different kind of humanity, like humanity 5.0 or whatever you want to call it. That's really what I'm going for. Mm-hmm. Let's liberate ourselves from this.
What would you say stands against that right now?
I would say that there's so much momentum built around what is that for people to change their minds, right? You know, I was just at a dinner for the heart hospital about a month ago. I'm retiring from the heart hospital that I co-founded, and they were giving me an award and talking about some things and blah, blah, blah. But what was interesting in talking with the other doctors there is I was explaining to them, well, what are you doing now? Well, this is what I'm doing. And they're like, what? What are you talking about? Right? It's so foreign to most people that they can't wrap their heads around it. And I think that's the biggest challenge.
Mm-hmm. Lack of a growth mindset.
Lack of a growth mindset, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So how about the role of mental health in aging?
Massive, massive. Anxiety, depression, PTSD, all these things, you know, this lack of safety. I think, you know, people live in fear. They beat themselves up all the time. I'm the hardest person on myself ever, right? I was like that in my 20s. Nobody was harder on me than I was, you know, things like that. I think many people have experienced that. I think that, you know, all of that self-imposed, quite honestly, all that self-imposed stress really ages us. It's been shown 1,000 times over that it really ages us. So getting rid of that, right? And just being like grateful to be here, right? It's like, wow, what a beautiful planet this is. What a beautiful day this is. What a beautiful conversation this is. Mm-hmm. Being grateful instead of being strapped to all that anxiety. Mm-hmm. That's massive. We're doing some cool things with that too. We're actually reprogramming. We can help reprogram people's brains using a special form, modified form of transcranial magnetic stimulation, where we can go in and map the brain with EEGs and then basically bring the neurons back into equilibrium again, and do that in conjunction with some peptides and some other things. And it's been remarkable. It's changed people's lives. They've gone from being anxious to being like calm. It's really cool.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Is there anything we haven't discussed that you would like to talk about?
Well, there are a million things we haven't discussed.
Yes, and there is certainly a lot in the book.
That's right. But we've covered a lot. I think, you know, hopefully the audience has a chance to sort of rethink your own thoughts about what aging means for you and where you are in the process. And do you know what cards you're holding? Have you had, you know, full genome sequencing done and things like this? Because if you're serious about wanting to really recapture your youth and live young for a long time, like I want to go snowboard with my great grandkids, right? I love that idea. So in order to do that, I've got to have an exponential strategy. And to do that takes time, attention, resources, but the return on investment is greater than anything you can imagine.
For
right?
sure.
So, yeah.
Having a full, happy life.
Absolutely. That's right.
Second to none.
Second to none. That's right.
Well, thank you very much for a really eye-opening interview.
Thank you.
I really loved listening to you, and I feel like rereading the book now that
Great.
I've spoken with you about all this. I hope our viewers read the book, buy the book, and put some of these principles into work for your own lives, because, you know, dying is not a choice, but how we live until we die and how we feel until we die, I believe is a choice. So I hope all of you make the right choice and follow what this book describes. And I will see you again for the next interview soon.